to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin. It is the last show being recorded, currently in 2022. You're going to be listening to this probably in 2023. It's going to be dropping January 1st, so Happy New Year, everybody. More importantly, Merry Christmas. I'm in the Antiochian Church, so I already celebrated on the new calendar, December 25th, Western Christmas. So Merry Christmas to everybody that celebrated the Nativity, the birth of Christ. Dmitry, of course, a few more days till he gets to celebrating, but it's good that here on the show both the calendars are represented here.
Yeah, we have a bit of diversity here, Conrad, in a way. We have both the new calendar and the old calendar represented, but of course, all of us Orthodox folks celebrate Easter on the same day, which we're looking forward to in 2023. And to all those on the old calendar, keep the fast up. There's only about a week left of fasting, and then Christmas is upon us. So, looking forward to that. And of course, today, most importantly, we'll be having essentially the podcast will be separated into firstly a news segment, and secondly we'll kind of just cover the huge year that 2022 was and all the events that have taken place and the different things that were said and done. I think there's a lot to discuss here, and from our perspective there's definitely been some titanic and gigantic changes that have taken place so far.
Oh, it's true. And we're both young, but I've been paying attention to geopolitics very seriously for at least 6 years now, and 2022 it's the craziest one. I dare say even crazier than 2016. So I think, or even 2020 when COVID started, perhaps. So that's a lot. And I think with all that being said, we've got a lot to talk about. Cyprus, more Ukraine, Russia, Turkey, Syria. These are big things. So let's just kind of dive right into that. I'm sure everyone is keeping up with our show closely, saw what happened in Cyprus. Unfortunately, it wasn't the result that we wanted. It's not necessarily some of it was surprising, not a huge surprise, at least the initial vote results necessarily, but disappointing nonetheless. As anticipated, Metropolitan Athanasios, destroyed and cleaned up, got, a very high percentage of the vote. He got 35%, which was almost double the second place vote. Both of the second and third place finishers received 18% of the vote. And below that, another Metropolitan received... what did he receive? He received 14% of the vote, and then Metropolitan Neophytos came fifth and received 10% of the vote. And still a good showing for Metropolitan Neophytos, but ultimately, after the election, many anticipated Metropolitan Athanasios to be appointed by the Synod. Unfortunately, Metropolitan George of Paphos, who barely came second, was made the Archbishop of Cyprus and is now acting as Archbishop of Cyprus. And he is, of all the candidates, he was the most schismatics in Ukraine. He's the most pro-ecumenical patriarch. He is the least traditional, and he's expressed that already in a number of ways. We're, of course, praying for him and his success, and we're in no way saying that one should, go into schism or disobey this bishop or anything like that. But it is unfortunate, and there was politics involved, and we're going to get into a little bit of that. But at the same time, there's no reason to get too, black-pilled about these kinds of church politics things. And despite Metropolitan Neophytos not making the cut there, we're fairly confident that God has even bigger things planned for him. But with all that being said, we're gonna get a little bit. There's some interesting details surrounding all the election and everything as well. So, Dimitri.
Yeah, so I think most importantly, Metropolitan Neophytos, at least some people online, some pundits, did comment on the fact that he didn't do too well in the election. They mentioned, well, perhaps the people of Cyprus have taken a stance against his radical position on, say, COVID, the vaccines, some of the prophecies he was espousing and talking about from the Greek elders. So Metropolitan Neophytos was, of course, the candidate which me and Conrad supported heavily. We thought his conservatism and as well as his adherence to church tradition very strong, and very unbiased, objective take on the whole Russia-Ukraine issue as well was just what Cyprus needed for a sort of prolonged, I suppose, vision and push towards the future, of an Orthodox wholesomeness. But in fact, unfortunately, we believe, for whatever reason, Metropolitan Georgios was elected, and he is now the new Archbishop. Now, Metropolitan Georgios, Archbishop Georgios, now, of course, as Conrad said, we should pray for him, but he was a very different sort of character. He never stood up against, of course, the COVID regime, never kind of commented at all about the vaccine. In fact, he himself is a scientist by profession, I suppose. A chemistry teacher in his own right. So in fact, we have this sort of dichotomy. We have the most based red pill, candidate from the clergy, Metropolitan Neophytos, on one hand, who questions the efficacy of the vaccine, questions its effectiveness, as well as the actual morals behind it. And then you have, on the other hand, Metropolitan Georgios, who ends up taking the upper hand in the popular vote, and he is by all means a man of science, so to speak, and of course a clergyman in the same right. And the last thing about Metropolitan Georgios, I suppose, just as for an introduction, he was very much he's a person of the status quo. He became a clergyman under the previous Archbishop of Cyprus, so of course naturally one would think that he would follow in the footsteps of his master and the person who has kind of elected him to the clergy in the first place all those years ago.
No, it's true, and unfortunately, again, some people had said like, oh, he got slightly less than 10% of the vote. Cyprus has totally rejected Metropolitan Neophytos, but Metropolitan Neophytos is from an archdiocese, a metropolia right on the border with occupied Turkey. He had immense support in his archdiocese. It is, again, metropolia. Sorry, it's confusing with the Greeks versus the more Slavic archdiocese structure here in America and how some of it goes, but metropolitans, archbishops. In Cyprus, the archbishop is the head of the whole church, and the metropolitans are below him. But in fact, Metropolitan Neophytos, as said by many not at all conservative or traditional Cypriot newspapers, had in many ways shown he has great support. He does have influence in the Holy Synod. And one of the big takeaways was, again, Metropolitan Athanasios, far and away the second most traditional bishop in the running after Metropolitan Neophytos, received almost 36% of the vote. Like over a third of the entire vote went to him. And despite that, he was not at all chosen by the synod. And I commented about this on Twitter and Telegram. Part of that as well has to do with if Metropolitan Neophytos, for example, had come third, as we had perhaps anticipated he would, that would have put a lot more pressure on the synod to elect Metropolitan Athanasios, because two of the three nominees would have been ostensibly at least against the schismatics in Ukraine and more on the traditional end of the spectrum. And they, of course, wouldn't want to elect Metropolitan Neophytos, so they would elect Metropolitan Athanasios and avoid some scrutiny. However, as we had mentioned in our previous episode, so much politicking and influence happened from the ecumenical patriarch, and I would say then thus covertly from the U.S. State Department, to get the previously anti-schismatic Metropolitan Isaiah on board with the schismatics. And he then came third, and so now you had two pro-schismatic candidates versus the one ostensibly kind of in the middle candidate, Metropolitan Athanasios, who in many ways, perhaps for the election, had kind of centered his position. And then because of that, the synod felt even more emboldened to just pick the very much establishment candidate, Metropolitan Georgios. And again, not to put too much stock into this, it's not gone forward. I think that the synod basically ignored it, but the mayor of a large town in Cyprus, I forget the name of it, a town of 40,000 people, had filed election integrity issues with this election, claiming that if this had been a political election, it would be an outrage, and people are just ignoring it because it's an ecclesial election. And unfortunately, I believe even about a third or even slightly less than a third of the eligible Orthodox voting population voted in this election, which does show that Cyprus has unfortunately shifted very cosmopolitan, very secular in recent years. But that's not to say that there isn't still hope. And as Dimitri mentioned, we had hoped the Metropolitan Neophytos had a grander vision. But in many ways, Metropolitan Neophytos is, in fact, more free now to pursue his vision, which is evangelizing the north of Cyprus. And not to bring in any drama, but I had kind of gotten into a bit of a spat with Trisagion Films, which is a great YouTube channel. I love what they do, so no hate towards them or anything. But they were talking about one of their main the people that operates their channel and their brand is Cypriot, and talking about how in Cyprus people didn't like Metropolitan Neophytos' anti-vax rhetoric and how they don't like his prophecies and it was scaring people. And he talked about how people thought that he was saying Turkey was going to invade, which I just think is so dishonest because, as we've talked about on this show multiple times, he explicitly says that's not going to happen. Cyprus isn't even going to be affected by like major violence of the Third World War. And he has a whole idea, and I would even say, unlike a lot of members of the Greek patriarchs in Cyprus, Alexandria, Greece, is very enthusiastic about evangelizing to the Turks in the north. And everyone involved in the election, of course, is against the invasion, is against Turkish occupation, is against everything that stands for, and the genocide and anti-Christianity that has come with all of that. But unlike Metropolitan Neophytos, a lot of them, it's really just more of a kind of Greek nationalism, being very pro-Greek, as opposed to having an actual desire convert the world and bring even the enemies of the church into the fold. And Metropolitan Neophytos, up there right on the border in Morphu, he has a great opportunity to continue that work. And even I've heard a vision to build a monastery on the other side and evangelize and spread the gospel to people who, even so recently, even in the 1970s, had participated in overt persecution of the church.
Yeah, and this sort of stance that, well, maybe Metropolitan Neophytos did not generate so many votes because of his radical conservatism and just the fact that most people in the modern world, well, modern world, so to speak, in brackets, has somehow, they're not prepared for this sort of radical orthodox position that, look, the world may enter into this sort of age of calamity, especially as due to people's sin and, of course, war, as well as, the God testing people, and especially sinners, to sort of change their ways is really like upon us. And, this kind of we're kind of at this doorstep of great things to come. And I found similar sentiments, of course, through interviews on Tsargrad TV recently, where a Russian mother who went to a really high class school in Moscow City, frankly, said that one of her daughters, who was about in 7th grade, about 12 or 13 years of age, said that, well, she was giving a class presentation in the Russian language and talking about how her elder brother was a member of the Russian military, and she was sent to the principal's office for bringing up the war in Ukraine. This is in a Russian, like a Russian middle school as well, mind you, in Moscow. So even high-class sort of bourgeoisie Russians are trying to somewhat avoid the topic of the war in Moscow, whereas the interviewer did mention the fact that if you go to any town in Russia, for example, Donetsk or Lugansk, of course, or for example, Rostov, or even some of the I guess now adjacent cities close to the Ukrainian conflict. The situation sort of changes. The people, their attitude towards towards the conflict, it becomes more patriotic. So there is this understanding that once a country becomes more capitalistic, more bourgeois, more people become richer and more comfortable with life, there drops off this need for sort of understanding that, look, yes, we live in a peaceful time now, but things may get more drastic. People don't want to think about death, calamity, challenges in life. The need for preparing for tribulations really falls away. Maybe this is the same attitude the Cypriots had now after there hasn't been a conflict with the Turks in maybe 20 plus years at this point. So all this sentiment towards these prophecies about the Greek conflict with the Turks in the future from Elder Paisios, these things don't really interest maybe the modern Cypriot. At least that's my opinion. Like a similar position to what maybe modern Russians have towards Ukraine, at least those in the big cities.
Oh, it's definitely true. And that's not to say that there are many pious people in Cyprus, and many pious people in Cyprus that may have, for better or for worse, had their reasons why they didn't vote for Metropolitan Neophytos. But at the end of the day, it is impossible to say that this was not something where the powers that be, involving the general conflict around us, the World War Now, as our show is called, as well as the internal conflicts within the church, had their hands on the scale kind of what was going on. And some people were saying they're very frustrated, like, why do you even put this to a vote if you're just going to pick the person that clearly didn't get the most votes? Like, just pick someone, Some were saying, like, the illusion of democracy is kind of funny and all of it. But because that's the way that the church has it right now, it's important to do everything you can in those situations to make sure that the right person gets votes, because people are going to be voting regardless. So with all that being said, I think we can maybe move away from Cyprus a little bit. So many people had talked about in all the stuff, the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the church issue was the number one issue. All these Cypriot magazines had every archbishop's perspective on it, lambasting Metropolitan Athanasios as a pro-Russian, because so many Russian pilgrims would go to some places in his metropolia that I guess he must be an agent of the Russian government because some reason. Very silly stuff, but they were very much drawing that line, with Metropolitan Neophytos being pro-Russian more in the middle, then like Metropolitan Athanasios, Metropolitan Nikiforos, they're calling them like total pro-Russian shills just because they hold the obviously true ecclesiological position that Constantinople can't issue tomos of autocephaly willy-nilly whenever they want in other people's jurisdiction. But with all that being said, we're going to move towards Ukraine. A lot of things have happened since we last spoke about it. It's been 2 weeks. You probably all are tired of even hearing about Bakhmut, just wondering when it's going to be taken, but we've got some things to talk about that. Dimitri, anything you want to let us know?
Yeah, so I think the recent development, Bakhmut has been sieged by the Russians for at least 1.5 months now, continuously. This city, of course, is at the crossroads of Donetsk and Lugansk, as you've probably heard on previous episodes. So it is very key for Ukrainians to hold it, as well as the Russians, because it opens this, I suppose, this gateway of opportunity to, push towards the western Ukrainian territories from any sort of angle. At this point, Bakhmut, of course, controls both the main roads from Lugansk and Donetsk westwards. So. And what's been happening in Bakhmut, essentially, Bakhmut's, the involvement of the Russian military has been quite minimal, and you may say, well, how does that work if there's fighting going on? Well, it's not the official Russian army that is fighting in Bakhmut at the moment. It is the mercenary organization, of course, led by Russians and mostly, employing Russians, called Wagner. And you've probably heard about Wagner, named after the famous German composer. This, as reported by a recent American military chief, this organization has risen in its population, I suppose, has increased from a mere 3,600 personnel in 2018 to at least, well, allegedly at least 50,000. Well, this is mind you, 50,000 armed forces in a mercenary group. That is a lot of folks, but this is of course American sources, and Russians are, frankly, very interestingly, republishing this news article. So the Americans are saying, well, Wagner has up to 50,000 personnel, and Russians are like, yes, of course it does, and they're all republishing this news. And I guess we do have to mention that 50,000 is quite a sizable force, frankly. Like we recall earlier this year in October, when Russians began the mobilization, and they said, well, we're going to recruit 300,000 personnel to join the military and aid in the special military operation. Now, 50,000, that's like quite a sizable percentage of that. And so Wagner has been effectively pushed back. They've been really pushing hard in Bakhmut, and yeah, of course, recently, unfortunately for them, they've been kind of ousted. The Ukrainians have been shoving them back, and they've kind of lost any gains they've made in the last fortnight or even month, I'd say. And what's their first reaction? What's the reaction of Wagner? Is to blame the Russian military leadership, Gerasimov Valery, who is the chief of staff of the Russian military, as well as Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, who Yevgeny Prigozhin publicly said that these people advocating for the special military operation are actually not giving us weapons, not giving us tactical, that tactical equipment for which we could actually fight the Ukrainians. So Yevgeny Prigozhin, the CEO of Wagner, he's the guy who actually runs the mercenary organization, is blaming the Russian politicians behind the scenes. It's very interesting. Mind you, Putin is never the target of any criticism in these sort of debates. Even when Kadyrov, the leader of the Chechen Republic, makes any anti-military statements, he's always specifically targeting them at certain individuals, but never Putin. Putin is kind of like, and for better or for worse, the man who brings the whole operation together and all these different various factions. I think we can both agree on that.
No, it's true. And then when it comes to Bakhmut as well, we know Surovikin, when he was appointed earlier, a few months back, he talked about as being in charge of the entire special military operation. He talked about this is not a war of dramatic town seizures, of big aero offensives and whatnot. This is a war of attrition. We're demilitarizing Ukraine. And I think if you go to the Wikipedia page for the Battle of Bakhmut, it's like, I don't know, like 18, I'm sure I'm using the wrong number, but it's like 18 battalions or something of Ukrainian military versus and it just has Wagner, DPR militia, Russian armed forces on the other side. And then it's like they were pouring thousands and tens of thousands of troops into Bakhmut. And of course, Dmitry explained, of course, it's somewhat strategic location, but a lot of people are like, why are they spending so much time defending this town that didn't even have 100,000 people in it before the war began? And there's, like Dmitry said, it has all this transportation importance, but even besides that, it's kind of become clear that if Ukraine loses this, they're probably going to lose some kind of support from the West, because if not, Zelensky is clearly trying to draw this as a line and really hold some of those grounds that were gained in the Kharkov offensive earlier in the year. And I think there's some truth to be said that if this doesn't hold for them and the Russians take it, which I think is inevitable, it might be, it might, again, people say the beginning of the end all the time, but that might be the last chance that might be the last chance for Kiev to get something that doesn't involve the fall of Kiev itself. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and of course the fall of Kiev, people might say, well, that's a bit exaggerated. Russia has no goal of taking Kiev, but no. The Russian foreign minister recently, Sergei Lavrov, does mention the fact that, look, if Zelensky and his government do not come to the the table of diplomacy and to sort of work out a peace treaty. The only way to successfully demilitarize and he uses the word denazify again Kiev and Ukraine is to, of course, take the capital itself, take Kiev. So Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, openly says this, and this has happened just in the last week at the end of December 2022. Again, it kind of kills any rhetoric from those folks, especially on the side that is anti-NATO, that they were claiming, well, Russia's going to sign a peace treaty, Russia's going to surrender its positions, it's going to give up Donetsk, Lugansk, it's going to give up Kherson and all those regions to Ukraine. But no, seemingly at the end of 2022, the year is ending on this position that no, Russia is actually, it's willing to come to the negotiating table, but only on actually proper terms which will benefit the Russian people and the Russian populace of Ukraine. Russia will not be having any of this genocidal rhetoric which Zelensky recently pushed in his 45-minute speech between Christmas and New Year's, which I think it's worthy of mentioning as well. Russia's not going to have the sort of cultural genocide of the Russian language where Russian statues are destroyed, sculptures are eroded, graveyards are raided, and of course the Russian language is removed from any school curriculums at all, even as an elective unit in Ukrainian high schools. This sort of position of Russia, of Lavrov, is very admirable, at least. Giving Zelensky and his government this ultimatum that, look, if you guys will not come to the negotiating table on, decent, actually reasonable terms, we will be taking it further. We will be taking Kiev as we promised in February 2022.
Well, and Putin has shed a little more light on what some might call the goal of the special military operation. And he talks more about and it's nothing that he hasn't maybe hinted at before, but he explicitly is talking about reunifying the Russian people. And that clearly involves, effectively in the next 10 years, I would say, having Belarus and then as many people as desire in Ukraine, which they would view as a solid plurality of the population in some regard, to be in Russia. I think that's what that means. And some would argue that that because of the context, this also includes certain parts of Kazakhstan. I have no idea. Some people would say, I've heard a lot of talk about Belarus, most of Ukraine, excluding the western portion, and then Russified northern Kazakhstan being kind of the current Putin vision of a reunified Russia. That's neither here nor there necessarily, but it seems that as of now, Putin has realized that if Zelensky is literally still talking about retaking Crimea, we need to ramp up the rhetoric a little bit, or else we're really not going to get anywhere if besides just a total collapse of everything in Ukraine. And the Russians still don't want that. The Russians really have no interest in ruling over ruins. I guarantee you they're not happy about how much they're having to rebuild Mariupol. They wish that didn't have to happen. And with all that, it seems that the Russians are extending that. They realize that they're not ever going to be able to govern Western Ukraine, and it seems that they're kind of extending certain pokes and olive branches towards Poland and Hungary to actually get involved, which is something we've, of course, talked about on this show since the beginning.
Funny enough, Putin does mention, Western Ukraine and Galiciana or Galicia, which is the western portion of Ukraine involving Lvov as well. So that particular region of Ukraine, I guess through historical means, has lost its Russianness over the last maybe 600 years. By Russianness, I mean Russian culture was very much Policized, and there was a lot of Lithuanian influx over the period when Poland actually controlled those lands. This is going back 500, 600 years. So, of course, these regions are probably the least Russian of any Ukraine, and even people from Western Ukraine, such as some of my personal friends, they don't speak Russian at all, frankly. They only speak Ukrainian, which is unheard of. Everybody in Kiev knows Russian, including Zelensky at one point spoke Russian better than he spoke Ukrainian. So Russian very much is not just a similar language to Ukrainian, but also it is kind of like, well, if you know, kind of, it's kind of similar to how Germans and French people, they do huge language exchanges. French students learn German students learn French, but it's even closer than that because the language is mutually understandable, and there's a complete link there. Of course, not just historically, but also linguistically. Now, as far as Galiciana goes, Putin does mention in a speech that, look, the Russian Empire, one mistake it did make was when it, dissected Poland between Austria-Hungary, Prussia, and Russia. It kind of took a large chunk of Poland and connected it to these Western Ukrainian areas, and he says these areas are the least Russian. Putin admits this recently in his 21st of December speech, which I think is worthy of listening to subtitles, because Putin does give his kind of like end of year perspective on the future, and he does say, look, the Russian Empire, which Putin isn't the biggest fan of the Russian Empire, like in his in his past speeches he did criticize it a lot, but here his only criticism seems to be that, look, the Russian Empire didn't realize in its time, 200 years ago, that, look, these Western Ukrainians are actually incredibly anti-Russian, and they do hold this internal anti-Russian sentiment, probably fed by Western propaganda even from centuries ago, but still. And the fact that these people live within the same borders as us, it does cause this sort of internal conflict. So Conrad is completely right that, whatever the future holds for Ukraine, there will be great debate over what happens in those Western regions. Should they retain some sort of political or quasi-cultural independence, or should they join maybe a country like Poland as a sort of federal entity? Who knows?
No, it's extremely interesting. And at the beginning of the conflict, people were talking about this, and people were like, this is LARP map stuff, like this is nonsense. And yet here we are still talking about it, very relevant. And even Viktor Orban himself in Hungary, he's given recent speeches about how Hungarians are oppressed all over. There's no Hungarian autonomy, I think, except for Serbia. Serbia has an autonomous Hungarian region, but every other area surrounding Hungary, whether it's Romania, Slovakia, Ukraine, Romania, Orban and his very popular nationalist party seem to be pushing the rhetoric that those Hungarians are oppressed, and it would benefit them to be reunited with their homeland. Of course, we talked about him wearing the Greater Hungary scarf, and his foreign minister, tweeting out to the Transcarpathian Hungarians that help is on the way, and these sorts of things. There are, of course, hundreds of thousands of Hungarians in the Transcarpathia region of Ukraine. They make up plurality of the population in a few areas. And so, with Poland and Hungary kind of representing the opposite end of the spectrum of pro-Russian and anti-Russian members of NATO and the European Union, it seems that Russia is kind of, with Putin's historical kind of talk, he was kind of showing Poland, like, look, we don't actually, you convinced all your people that we, like, fundamentally despise the existence of Poland and don't want that to happen, but that's not true. And I'm saying this, and I'm extending you this kind of idea that you can kind of go in there. And because from Russia's perspective, there's no difference between Poland controlling Lvov and Ukraine controlling Lvov. It's the same at this point. And at this point, Russia would kind of benefit from, at this point, it seems that Russia would benefit from just disrupting the general security architecture of Europe, because the EU would have no way to, it is very much a concept that was made much later, after ideas of, irredentism and reclaiming your population across other borders. Like that's something that the EU is against. Like, you're supposed to not do any more of those things once you join the EU. So if Hungary and Poland take these opportunities, they're already sanctioned by the EU for their sodomite, anti-LGBT kind of stuff. Is this going to be, would that be a further kind of domino in the collapse of the European Union?
Yeah, I think it's also like a very positive development. Seeing Poland and Hungary, of course, developing their own national identities after the 1990s, after the fall of the, sort of the Eastern Bloc USSR. It's very, I guess, in a way, they're showing the rest of Europe that, look, we can still remain within the EU, but we can also follow our internal, I guess, personal interests and sort of, generate this cultural autonomy and cultural individualism without, crazy hyper multicultural immigration and other changes that the EU is almost forcing upon its neighboring countries. I think one important thing is that Zelensky seems to really ignore this particular fact. He's claiming, even recently in Zelensky's 45-minute speech, he does mention the fact that, we are striving to join the European Union, and then right after that he mentions some World Economic Forum talking points, such as Ukraine is aiming towards becoming one of, like, completely sustainable by green energy, and completely changing its economy from gas and fossil fuels to just these absurd talking points. Not even speaking about nuclear power or any actual reasonable alternatives towards fossil fuels. Like, it's really Zelensky, of course, at the end of the day, is a puppet of Western state, as well as globalist, I wouldn't even say officially Western state sponsors, but actual globalist interests, and he does meet with these people, and it's not just his particular reasonable rhetoric which can be questioned here, I think. And let's just say, let's put it I guess to rest, this recent speech of Zelensky is not, at least at this point, at the end of December, it's not being listened to by Western media sources. They're ignoring it because, in effect, and I don't want to use any, I don't want to sound cliche here, but it was very Hitler-esque in a way. Zelensky stands up in parliament and for 45 minutes talks about the great independent Ukraine and the fact that Russians will be pushed out of Crimea, pushed out of Donetsk, Lugansk, that Ukraine will be great independent, it'll use green energy, Ukrainian language will dominate, the Russian church will be suppressed. So he doubles down on the fact that the Russian church in Ukraine, which, mind you, 70% of the population follow that particular church and denomination and religion, Zelensky says that they are morally corrupt and they will be shut down. So he doubles down on the banning of the, the particular autonomous branch of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And this is, of course, a religious persecution at its best. So Zelensky is this sort of criminal character who recently made his statements absolutely clear. And try to, just as an experiment, Google Zelensky speech Rada, end of December 2022. See if anything comes up. If you type in Zelensky speech 2022, you won't find the result on the first page. This recent speech of his has not been translated into English, at least not at the time of this recording. So it does seem like Western media sources, or at least media sources which are liberal progressive, are trying to shut down this particular statement by Zelensky that, look, Ukraine is this great superpower that's going to fight Russia till the very end, and we're willing to spill all this blood. And yeah, of course, he mentions the fact that electricity is down, and Ukrainians are willing to live without electricity, and that's green alternative. Like, it's completely nutty stuff. This guy is a clown, and of course, his rulership of Ukraine has caused more disasters and tragedies than any other president in Ukrainian history, I'd say.
No, it's insane. And of course, you make a good point that there's no benefit that the West gets from covering the latest speech. And it's evidence that Zelensky's facing trouble at home, that he needs to be giving these big kind of displays of Ukrainian nationalism and anti-Russian sentiment. And it's horrible. I mean, I believe they forcibly renamed the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is the church that's in communion underneath the Russian Orthodox Church, the largest and oldest Orthodox church, the only Orthodox church in the country, the church that has been there since, the baptism of the Rus by Saint Vladimir. All this is the Orthodox Church in Kiev, not the fake schismatic one established, a few years ago. And not only has the name forcibly been changed, it's been basically banned. There's so many more videos of priests being assaulted. The amount of SBU, like flex pictures in front of random monasteries, is just insane. They've basically visited everyone at this point, every parish as well. And so we encourage everybody, please pray for the church. And while we've mentioned before, it seems that because of all of this, the Ukrainian church has declared, some senses of autonomy and these other things to distance itself from Russia in the eyes of, the authorities who are persecuting them. But in spite of all that, Patriarch Kirill and the Russian Orthodox Church, in Moscow, they've very much stated their continued support for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I believe Patriarch Kirill told clerics to not comment on the canonical status of Metropolitan Onufry and the UOC because of the persecution they're facing and how hard it is. And they've what is it he says? Patriarch Kirill says, we issued a statement to express support for the bishops, clerics, monastics, and laity who are striving to preserve the unity and canonical structure of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, even in the current difficult circumstances. And then he goes on to say that we're going to do everything we can to bring international attention to just the horrible things going on, to people just trying to worship God and worship Jesus in Ukraine in the canonical Orthodox fashion. And we've talked about this on almost every episode. It keeps getting worse. And it seems that, like we've said, though, this kind of desperation from Zelensky and they're going after it, it definitely is a sign of total potential collapse, both whether it's from his regime to a possible replacement, whether it's Zelensky or some of the other military puppets the U.S. has in there, or just, final, total collapse, and then the Russians would be able to exert hard or soft, whether they actually take Kiev or they just get a guy that they have through their more covert sources. That's something that seems to be getting closer and closer.
Yeah, I think Patriarch Kirill's recent speech has been incredibly humble, and of course he totally understands the difficult position of Metropolitan Onufry and all the Ukrainian/Russian clergymen in the Ukraine at the moment. They are under persecution, huge coercion and pressure, so some of their more, I guess, implicit anti-Russian statements, right, can be taken with a huge grain of salt, as we've mentioned on previous episodes. Metropolitan Onufry is in a very difficult position. Patriarch Kirill and the leadership of the Russian Church at home, in Moscow and other places around Russia, they do understand that. And, I'm very glad, actually, that, Patriarch Kirill asks everybody not to panic, that, the real problem here is, of course, the war itself and the conflict and the actual persecution that's going on, not the statements which are forced out of passion, desperation, and not just that, and simply people despairing and trying to find ways to stop these Ukrainian federal agents from literally infiltrating, searching their offices, raiding these these churches, these church halls, just affecting the worship of Christian people who just want to worship Christ, the saints, Mary, the Mother of God, and just participate in liturgy. And of course, this is during Christmas as well, so it adds that extra level of, well, we're going to exert this power of anti-Christianity during this holy period of the end of the year. So that needs to be mentioned. And of course, Zelensky, as Conrad mentioned, he didn't begin this persecution early on in the conflict. He even, in a way, tried to invoke the power of Christianity to fight back, say, the Russian special military or operation. You recall in April 2022, Zelensky actually appears in an Orthodox church, a Ukrainian one, and he does mention that, look, he mentioned that this is a great feast day. He doesn't actually say Christ is risen because, for him it would probably be against his personal religion if he has one. But he does give this sort of patriotic speech for a minute and a half in a Christian church, saying that, look, this is a great feast day. I hope it unites the people. This and that, political statement of sorts. Now the question is, will Zelensky give such a speech on the 7th of January inside a Christian church again? I kind of doubt it. And as well, coming up to Easter in 2023, again, I believe it's on the 12th or 26th of April 2023, will Zelensky be giving any more speeches inside of Christian churches after this, sort of age of persecution and prosecution of Christianity? I think that stands to be in question here.
Well, no, we'll be looking out for what Putin and Lavrov have to say on, January 6th, 7th, old calendar Christmas time as well. But with all of that being said, you were just talking a lot about both Ukrainian and Russian society. People have talked a lot about this latest military-industrial commission, Medvedev's appointment to it, and then increases in Russia's spending on the military. Before we kind of move away from this conflict, I want to get your thoughts on that and how you think that's going to affect the general conflict and whether or not it seems to me that Russia's generally slowly but surely gearing up towards a war economy.
Yeah, so recently, just the day after Christmas, on the 26th of December, or the day of, Western Christmas, 26th of December, Putin, of course, announces that he's naming Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, the chief of the Military Industrial Commission, this new sort of military organization. I guess you can call it the birth of the new, or the improvement of the military industrial complex in Russia. So, as well as the Russian military budget, it has been announced to be increased in the next coming years, which, of course, what does this speak for the Russian people? Well, I think militarily Russia has always been the second greatest military since the fall of the Soviet Union. And Russia, one thing it has inherited from the Soviets has been this military, I guess, regime. That's one thing the Yeltsin period of the 90s didn't actually reform and didn't destroy entirely. So Russia did inherit this great military from the Soviet Union, from the period of the Red Army. Now, what's interesting is Dmitry Medvedev recently, 10 years ago, he was known as a great liberal in Russia. He was the guy importing smartphones and iPhones. He was mucking around. He was investing into nanotechnology and all this weird, goofy stuff, and space exploration and all this really bizarre kind of almost money laundering schemes in the 2011, 2010 period. And of course, now Dmitry Medvedev, at least recently, you can follow him on Telegram. He's been posting some incredibly patriotic, anti-Ukrainian, as well as pro-Russian statements. He's been probably the greatest advocate for the special military operation since its onset. He's been, he said even more radical things than Putin, or I would want to say even Kadyrov. He's pretty much, how would I say it in Russian, on переплюнул всех. So he kind of really took it to this next degree, and now I guess this he's been given this particular post of I guess the head of the deputy chairman of the Military Special Industrial Commission, which I guess we'll see exactly when the actual paperwork comes out what this military commission will take itself upon. I'm personally of the understanding that this commission will prepare perhaps for a second great mobilization, which may take place around middle of 2023, probably around the summertime. So, and also to kind of reorganize and keep everybody in check now that Russia has entered into this phase of, well, almost open confrontation with the West, at least definitely into a Cold War 2.0 World War sort of stage. Now that Russia needs to kind of change its outlook on military conflict. It's no more of these, as we mentioned on former episodes, no more of this like separate small brigades operating like kind of in a disconnected fashion. No, the rebuilding of this Red Army, the rebuilding of this Russian imperial military force has begun, I think, full force in 2022. And Dmitry Medvedev seems to be the first honorary head of this engagement, and we'll be looking for any developments on this front.
No, and this also comes alongside China. Again, China hasn't done something like say we support the special military operation, but they very much like maintained neutrality and maintained positive relations with Russia, and are discussing now with Russia even expanding more yuan, ruble direct trade. I believe Putin and Xi recently had a video conference where Putin expressed a strong desire to have Xi come to Moscow, and Xi didn't object to that in any way. So perhaps in the next quarter we could see maybe a Xi-Putin summit, which would fully, I mean, it's already kind of cemented, but it seems that China is very much all in with what Russia is doing, because they even, I believe they sent a ship to Guam. They've been buzzing U.S. planes with their warplanes more aggressively than ever. And North Korea has also been acting very aggressive, shooting down even South Korean planes, sending missiles over Japan, all these things. So China and the non-Western aligned Sinosphere is very much aligning with Russia, and China has a vested interest, of course, in supporting the geopolitical idea of reterritorialization in Ukraine, because it would very much legitimize their impending, reunification with Taiwan. And I think that's very important, because a lot of time you can see Western media very much trying to like I was reading this, I believe, in Cyprus Mail, which is a left-leaning Cypriot newspaper, talking about they believe that the Russian operation is totally failing, and they try to paint this picture that Xi is like afraid of appearing too close with Putin. But if you look at just what's happening economically and based on currency and stuff, it's the greatest realignment since the Cold War, objectively speaking. So I think just because China is trying to lay low, they're facing a lot of internal issues right now. The U.S. is really, really exploiting the COVID thing. So China, they don't have, in some ways, they have less liberty than Russia to act and to make statements. So I think people need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, of course. And as we mentioned maybe a couple months ago, like just the fact that China has essentially seen this as an opportunity, not just to investigate in a military sense what modern warfare looks like and, which particular avenue to develop. I think definitely drone warfare and great artillery developments are currently ongoing in China, but also just the fact that economically speaking, exactly what power does the West have to sanction a country into the Stone Age, so to speak, as they wish they could have done to Russia? And the power is, frankly, it's not that strong. Like, we've never seen sanctions of this kind on Russia since, maybe the mid-2010 period when, Russia began sanctioning all these liberal organizations and all those controversies back then during the third term of Putin. But this, of course, speaks greatly to the fact that, well, the Chinese economy is a lot more powerful than the Russian one and a lot more well-connected. So if China does seek, say, to invade Taiwan or even to reintegrate itself with Taiwan, maybe through forceful or some sort of powerful diplomatic measures, is there anything that the West can actually do? Is there anything that countries, belonging to the United States, the Commonwealth of, Great Britain or the European Union, can they do anything to stop that? And the answer is most likely no. And Xi Jinping understands this. And yeah, of course, he's moving with adamant determination. And of course, some developments on the North Korean front as well. Kim Jong-un just absolutely, being a baller in the year of 2022 after, of course, his great meetings with Trump, prior to the Biden presidency. This is, I guess, the second big outing of Kim Jong-un as this independent decision maker. Like he's simply doing what he wants, and of course flexing North Korea's military muscle, not afraid of Western sort of threats at all. I think that's sort of a really good thing to just discuss, just the fact that Kim Jong-un and North Korea has kind of risen to the task of like absolutely dismantling Biden's image of any sort of foreign political expert of some sort. Like, because there's this idea that Biden's been in politics for 40-50 years, and yeah, he participated in some small diplomatic meetings over the decades, especially in the 80s, but people like Kim Jong-un have really taken that apart. And of course, him dealing with somebody like Donald Trump, who's a businessman with almost no political experience, in 2017 and 18, it just shows that, look, real powerful leaders of Asia, they do not take Biden seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think in so many ways we're just seeing unipolarity, multipolarity. Everyone hears these words all the time, but we're just seeing in real time the diplomatic, the financial, and the cultural collapse of these institutions in the West and this empire. And eventually, I think we're going to see the military collapse. And this is a bit controversial in some ways, due to a lot of ways in increased diversity, decline, and engineering, intellectual capability, all sorts of things. Jim Jatchis has talked about this as well as others. I don't think that NATO and the US are actually as capable of, running a clean sweep on the Russian military in a direct confrontation as they think. And I'm not talking about nuclear weapons or whatever people say. I'm talking about conventional on-the-ground warfare. And because of that, I think if you factor in China, it's 100% a victory for the non-NATO aligned bloc. And I think that's one of the big things it would explain actually a lot of the behavior, because at a certain level, we're going to reach a point where if the US went into Iraq, why have they not gone into Ukraine? And the only answer is fundamental decline.
Yeah, that's right. I think especially most people, when they talk about the US military, they speak about the Navy in particular, and just the fact that these aircraft carriers are unmatched on the seas. No other country has as many aircraft carriers or even naval vessels as the US. But where have we seen these naval vessels shine recently? I think you could say only in one Iraq and two Yugoslavia NATO, when they were present there during the bombardment in the 90s. So we've only seen, we can say, two particular areas. And mind you, these aircraft carriers, they take so much maintenance. They're essentially cities on the sea. A lot of people think they're just like large boats. No, they're essentially big. These gigantic ships which require thousands of people to maintain and build. And the US economy going into a recession in 2022, I think it's very obvious to everybody, can the US maintain such a powerful navy during a recession when the US dollar, of course, slightly drops in value, or even the possibility of the US dollar dropping in value, just that fear. I think this is all a looming tragedy for the United States military. And yes, Conrad was completely right. Why hasn't the US at least even entered into Western Ukraine, at least to secure some of the supplies of arms which they're sending into Ukraine? And even some of these mercenary bases, like they've not armed them at all. They're sending teachers to teach Ukrainian, Spetsnaz and Ukrainian, special forces. But beyond these teachers, we don't see any official United States, on the ground forces there. And I think the reason is because the United States is no longer ready for an upfront conflict, I think. And, I guess the primary evidence for that would be the fact that the US withdrew from Afghanistan almost without even setting a sort of status quo to remain there after their departure. I think that's evidence that, look, they weren't willing to remain in Afghanistan any longer, that certain powers were exerted, and now their capacity is diminished. And, the capacity of the US military, unfortunately, is in decline.
Look, the U.S. Navy is 62% non-Hispanic white. The Army is 54% non-Hispanic white. We know that they've had trouble meeting their recruitment goals. Israel recently downed all their F-35s because so many in the U.S. are falling apart and failing. There's just so many points of evidence that the U.S. military is just not what it used to be. And we have absolutely no frame of reference for how this diverse, funky military, led by, Mark Milley, who wants to investigate white rage. We have no idea exactly how this military would interact with a not diverse Russian military, a not diverse Chinese military, or a coalition of these forces. Even among the Russian forces, we were talking about this before we started recording, Russia have these distinct groupings and command structures that within them are very unified and what you would say not diverse, between the Chechen faction, PMC Wagner, the Donbass militias, and the Russian military, which those two are probably the most integrated again at this point. But this is how you run an imperial army, not let's, demoralize the majority, elevate the minority, and then hope that it all works out, while doing the same in our engineering department and hope they also make good missiles and stuff.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's important to understand the Russian military at the moment. Yes, Russia is an incredibly multicultural country, but they do have these pockets of concentrated, not diversity, but actually this identity. So you have the Chechen particular military divisions and brigades, which are 99% Chechen, and the 99% of them worship Muslim, and they worship Allah, and they adhere to the tenets of Islam, at least those that the Chechen people generally practice. And so we have this these groupings of people, and they're not all motivated by religion. For example, PMC Wagner, the mercenary group we spoke about earlier with apparently 50,000 members, they're mostly probably motivated by perhaps not patriotism, but probably just being cool and like being considered this epic, G.I. Joe type force, which is motivated by maybe a larger income than the Russian military can provide. So perhaps money is the motivator, but they aren't under any illusion that it isn't money. So there isn't like a fake patriotism that Wagner stand up to. But the Russian military, of course, like the particular Spetsnaz and some of these other like small organization of elite forces inside Russia, and even Donbass and Donetsk, like Donetsk, Lugansk, how could these forces have upkept such solidarity over 8 years with almost no support from Russia except humanitarian donations with almost no equipment? Well, it's because they actually are united around the idea that Russian culture is this particular value that they need to uphold against this onslaught of Western degeneracy and of course the Ukrainian cultural genocide, which was ongoing for the last 30 years at least, and of course it's ongoing now, and Zelensky keeps pushing it. So these particular groupings in the Russian military, in the coming Russian imperial army, are motivated by various different things. I think, of course, the majority of the Russian army, as we saw with the participation of the Russian bishops and the clergymen, are Russian Orthodox, and Orthodoxy stands up against all the degeneracy pushed by Zelensky, pushed by even the United States Army. Like Conrad mentioned, the fact that the U.S. military is, of course, it is incredibly powerful to this day. Yes, it perhaps is in a diminished state, but what exactly unites these diverse and multicultural troops? Is it Protestantism? Is it Catholicism? Is it this belief in the founding fathers and the Constitution? What Constitution? The one that Biden and some of his cronies are constantly encroaching upon? Like, the question arises, like, what do you think would keep troops more united? Orthodox actual Christianity, attending liturgy, or this idea that, well, we have to uphold this document given to us by our founders 250 years ago, which the current leadership of my country hates, which Biden, Kamala Harris always speak about the fact that the Constitution is outdated and needs to be changed. Like, these things need to be taken into consideration. And I think, mind you, Chinese analysts are sitting there, they're watching, and that's why they're building a strong national identity on similar to what Russia's doing at the moment. They are not copying the United States multicultural model. They are copying a unified imperial Russian model at the moment.
Oh, it's true, and I'm very much looking forward to the next decade of Russian patriotic media that I'm sure will have no shortage of stories and recreations and great films based on patriots, like Givi and Motorola, or unknown heroes that are being made right now in the Donbass region. And these are the kinds of events that shape geopolitics and geography and ethnography for generations to come. I mean, the Donbass region could be a warrior caste in the growing Russian Empire for multiple generations now because of this, because for no other reason than they had to be for 8 years before the Russians came to help. And with all that being said, I think we could talk about Russia and the Russian military forever. Before we move on to Turkey and Syria and some crazy stuff going on there, we're going to go a little bit eastward with some friends of ours who also went eastward. Our favorite neo-Nazis, the Azov Battalion. They went on a little trip to Israel, which I think is a bit funny for obvious reasons. But there's a video of them on Twitter, dancing, in the circle at in a very stereotypically Jewish fashion. And there was even an article, and they did an interview one of the leaders of Azov who was in Mariupol fighting, where at that point there were also a lot of atrocities committed there. Of course, Azov, not just considered military combatants to Russia, these are, terrorists. They're part of the goal of the special military operation is to eliminate, these groups of people. But the leader of the Azov regiment said, Mariupol is our Masada. Masada, of course, being a very well-known kind of it's a national park in the Holy Land, and it's a very, well-known place for people in Israel. And it's just very ironic, and of course, Azov from the beginning, despite being, anti-Semitic neo-Nazis, whatever, were funded by, Jewish billionaires who had vested interest in disrupting a Russian-influenced Ukraine and, orchestrating things like the Maidan Revolution in 2014. And of course, Azov, big enemies of Putin. This is all very interesting, I think. At the same time, recently, Benjamin Netanyahu, very ultra-Zionist, leader of Israel, has come back into power after he was ousted a few years ago. And one of the first to congratulate him, of course, is Vladimir Putin. He's he's wishing him well, which is ironic, despite the fact that some of his greatest enemies, the Azov Battalion, are visiting Israel. They're not being investigated. These terrorists are allowed to go there. So there's some other crazy alliances too that this conversation, the segue is going to lead us into. But I think Dimitri, what do you think about some of these interesting bedfellows?
Yeah, I think Putin just needs to understand that the Orthodox Jewish community, regardless of what some of the members of the Jewish community in Russia believe and their support for the special military operation, or even Putin and his United Russia Party, Putin needs to understand these people are not his friends. They're not for Assad. Israel has bombed Syria countless times. They're not pro-Russian. They take any opportunity to accuse former Russian leaders of anti-Semitic conduct, including, of course, even powerful figures from Russia's history, such as Stalin, even Joseph Stalin. They accuse him of anti-Semitism because he, say, killed many Jewish Bolsheviks or executed them. And they bring up all these various examples, which even Putin, I'm sure, wasn't really aware of. But they present these challenges to Russian history, calling Russians anti-Semitic. So the Jewish establishment, I guess, internationally speaking, even if a small portion of it is, I guess, in a utilitarian fashion pro-Russian, generally they are not pro-Russian history. They aren't pro-Russian culture. They certainly aren't pro-Orthodoxy, and that being Russian or Greek Orthodoxy, regardless of jurisdiction or particular local church denomination, they will target Orthodox Christianity and essentially culturally subjugate, as we see in the Ukraine currently, right? And of course, Igor Kolomoisky, right, one of the main, at least the face of the founding of the Azov Battalion, Azov recently visited Israel and danced around to Hava Nagila, as Conrad mentioned. But Igor Kolomoisky is based in Dnipropetrovsk, or at the moment, the city, actually, it's a gigantic city in Ukraine called Dnipro, has the largest Jewish community, and not just that, it has a gigantic Jewish hotel called the Menorah. You can search up Menorah Dnipro in Google and just have a look. These sort of foundational Jewish communities in Ukraine are vehemently anti-Russian, anti-Orthodox Christian. The attempted cementing of Orthodox Jewry in Ukraine is kind of built as a counterweight to Russian Orthodoxy. So in a way, Zelensky, shutting down the Orthodox Church is bringing to light the idea that, look, Zelensky isn't touching the Orthodox Jewish community in any way, but he is negatively impacting the Russian Orthodox community. So, and of course, similar developments we can see in Israel at the moment, which I think Putin should be very much aware of, and hopefully he is aware. I know he's probably busy reading, basically reports from what's going on the Ukraine front, but there should be some awareness given to the Russian politicians or the Russian leadership that the Greeks in Israel at the moment are being persecuted quite heavily. I think there's something that needs to be said about this.
No, it's very true. And again, we know that the biggest patrons of, Orthodox holy sites in the Holy Land, Israel, Palestine, are Russian Christians, Orthodox Christians, of course. And recently, very recently, the Jerusalem Patriarchate property that was owned by it was stormed and seized by radical Israeli groups. This is in the Palestinian part of the Old City. And the Jerusalem Patriarchate released a statement. They say, the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem condemned the storming of its land today, Tuesday, December 27th, by an Israeli radical group in Wadi Hilweh of Silwan, south of the Old City of Jerusalem. And basically what happened was it's like 5,000 square meters, so not like a tiny area. Within the city was like cordoned off. The Israeli police helped this group, of course, and they set up security cameras so that then they could monitor it and ostensibly prosecute people who had owned it before by the Jerusalem Patriarchate for trespassing on their now acquired property, I guess. And it's important not just for general Orthodox unity that I think Putin be a little bit more aware of what's going on here, but in many ways, the Jerusalem Patriarchate is one of the last Greek patriarchates holding out in favor of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the schism. Antioch is as well, but Antioch in many ways has the benefit of a lot of being in Syria. The Patriarch's in Damascus. They have a lot of Arab influence as well. The Patriarch of Jerusalem is very Greek. It's almost entirely Greek, actually, which could change. It'd be better if they did even some Hebrew and evangelism and other things and whatnot, but they've held very strongly against the schismatics despite strong pressure from the Fanar and, of course, from, I'm sure, the State Department. As one of the leading Christian figures in the Holy Land, they would love to have them on the side of, U.S. interests in the region. But he stood very strongly, and I think it would be wise for Putin to take these ecclesial concerns into just as equal concern, perhaps, as some of the geopolitics, because for the people there, it really does matter.
Yeah, of course, and it's key to keep in mind the Jerusalem Patriarchate and the Orthodox Greeks of Israel have supported the Russian Patriarchate and have been anti-schism this entire time. So, and they've never faltered. I believe not a single bishop of that church has ever sort of sided with the ecumenical patriarch or, say, some of the Ukrainian statements and things of that nature. So they've been very, very much united in their front for actual Orthodox tradition and for this conservative position on Ukraine. Now, another thing I think that's important that needs to be said is the fact that Russians themselves have overseas diaspora jurisdiction in Israel. It's called, it's under the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, so ROKOR. And you can actually check out the parishes themselves if you go to Mission ROKOR, ROCOR.ru, and just check out, they have a contacts page where you can actually see the various monasteries and parishes owned by Russians, founded by Russians over 100 years ago. They were white Russians which escaped the Soviet Union and the Civil War, which essentially all these monasteries and churches were founded by the Russian royal family and the Russian Empire over 200 years ago, and they still stand to this day, funded by immigrants and refugees from Russia. And so these communities are more Russian than they are Greek. And what will happen when, say, the Zionist forces in Israel suddenly start sending federal agents or, in their sort of task of subjugating Palestinians? What will happen when they actually start harassing Russian Orthodox folks? Like, on one hand, you can say, well, they're Greek Orthodox, they're different. Well, okay, what happens then? How will Putin and how will the Russian political elite react when Russians begin to actually become victims of this harassment? And as you can see from that website, missionrokor.ru, there are many Russian communities which are, of course, they still entertain many pilgrims from Russia and Ukraine and all around the world, frankly, for that matter. And yeah, that's the great question. I think Putin does need to, despite his friendship with Netanyahu, he does need to put his foot down and actually claim that, look, we are the protectors of Orthodox Christians around the world. This was the mission, of course, of the Russian Empire in the past, which now that you see Russians flying around yellow, black, white flags, this was the goal of the Russian Empire, to protect Orthodox Christians internationally. Putin should pursue these ends as well.
Oh, I totally agree. And this sort of, these kind of interests convoluting and crossing over with each other leads us into one of the other big conflicts and developments, which is Turkey and Erdogan meeting with Assad and discussing things and agreeing actually to pull out of Syria entirely. And they released a joint statement. This is from Baron of the Taiga, a great friend of ours on Twitter. Turkey has agreed to withdraw occupation forces from northern Syria and reportedly come to an understanding with Damascus that, and this is a quote, the U.S. and Israel's agents, the PKK, which are the Kurds, pose the biggest threat to Syria and Turkey. And this is very big. I mean, this is Turkey, a NATO power, the second largest military in NATO after the United States, meeting with Syria, whose lands they had 100% illegally invaded, to be fair, against the Kurds, who have also given Assad trouble. But they released this statement. And of course, Erdogan himself, as an ally of Putin, has done his best to keep Turkey neutral, for better or for worse, on the Ukrainian conflict, despite big pressure internally and externally. In Syria, and Assad, of course, possibly Russia's biggest ally outside of Belarus. And they're saying this directly. Again, we said Putin congratulating Netanyahu. Meanwhile, Syria and Turkey are condemning Israel as basically foreign funders of terrorists in their lands. And of course, there have been huge amounts of terrorist attacks. Even in this past week, I believe there were 7 casualties in a big hotel explosion in Ankara, I believe, or somewhere in Turkey. And now with Syria saying this directly, you're wondering if Israel, and Turkey as well has ties to Israel. Azerbaijan and Israel are very close allies, and Turkey and Azerbaijan are closer than ever. So this kind of demonstrates the extremely convoluted tangle of alliances and webs of relationships that these leaders in these countries have, and how as things heat up in Ukraine and the violence heats up, it's kind of driving people towards one side or the other, and people are forced to make decisions. So it's really interesting. I'm not even bringing in the Caucasus and Armenia, which Armenia seems to be further and further siding with the West, and Russia, for better or for worse. Again, I'm not so sure my take on it exactly, but they seem to be siding more with Azerbaijan slowly but surely, and that's unfortunate for the people of Artsakh. But it's I don't think Pashinyan is making the right call there. But this whole region, from the Holy Land up to the Levant, up to the Caucasus, I mean, it's just they say may you live in interesting times, but the people may be kind of tired of the interesting times.
Yeah, that's right. These regions haven't seen peace for at least, since ISIS came around in 2014, like just around the time of the Ukrainian conflict as well. And ISIL are still around in eastern Syria, so and western Iraq. So those who think that Donald Trump defeated ISIS or Russia defeated ISIS, yeah, they did actually, stop quite a large cohort of, and they took many ISIS-held cities. But ISIS is definitely still around, and Syria is not entirely controlled by the Assad government, so that should be considered. That, and remember, ISIS has very deep ties to, say, different sort of dark operations, held by the CIA. There's even a museum in Moscow, frankly, of the Syria 2017 Syrian campaign, which shows American equipment which was somehow taken by ISIS and held by ISIS, and now these trophies, I suppose, these trophies of the Russian war in Syria, the Russian peaceful intervention, shall I say, in Syria, are now being displayed in Moscow. So somehow these ISIS troops are either trained by America. There's some involvement there, so it's not exactly straightforward, and that's one aspect of it that I think folks we aren't seeing today. Is notice Joe Biden's United States is not as involved in the Middle East as Donald Trump was. You remember Donald Trump, there was the threats of him actually pressuring Iran, him dropping a Moab on ISIS in Syria, doing all these things with Israel, actually recognizing the Golan Heights. But Joe Biden, with his incompetence, seems to be more introverted rather than extroverted, and perhaps this is giving, say, people like Putin, people like Assad, and even Erdogan some breathing room to actually make arrangements and actually set up the Middle East as they see fit. Of course, people like Netanyahu probably are even more stressed out by this, because the only thing they're receiving, essentially, and Israel does receive billions of taxpayer dollars every single year. I think close to 40 billion a year, or between 30 and 40 at this point. But look, even Israel has moved to the background here in comparison with the almost 100 billion that the US has donated to Ukraine over the last year. So we see that the Biden presidency, in a way, is kind of having this hands-off strategy around the Middle East, and powerful actors are taking control of it. And I think people like Netanyahu are kind of left here in the dark. They're not given any sort of real position to move on. Unlike Trump, who is incredibly philo-Semitic, this Joe Biden presidency has a very particular approach to the entire Middle East situation.
Well, actually, I think we're seeing the actualization of what the War on Terror's ultimate goal was. And it started off as an anti-Islam operation justified by the nonsensical 9/11 event. And that allowed the deep state and, the American empire to garner support for their operations overseas. This war on terror, this kind of obscure, fourth weird generation of warfare, where that wasn't a declaration of war, but you could do whatever you wanted because it was these disparate groups in different countries. It gained support among the American population, and now we've seen Islam is no longer necessarily a threat, because frankly, if it ever was a threat, the whole radical Islam thing was orchestrated by the CIA in a large part. Not to say radical Islam isn't a real thing and that there isn't real Islamic persecution, but the war on terror was never about saving Christians in the Middle East. It was about overthrowing regimes that weren't willing to play ball with the petrodollar and the US empire. And now that that's no longer run its course, Israel, for better or for worse, Islam is more organized against Israel than Christianity. So now that Islam is no longer this threat, the US no longer has its overt reason to just completely fund Israel however they want. Of course, they'll always support them in the broader conflicts and always support their defense and never vote against them and always support the blatant violations of agreements and treaties that they commit. They'll always receive this support in a certain degree, but now the main focus is on Christianity, frankly, and that's seen both in Ukraine and on the domestic front here in America. The war on terror has totally come home. All you hear, the military, we've talked about Milley before, the CIA, it's all about domestic terrorism. It's all about these white people, these Christian nationalists, these people in America, these pro-Russians, perhaps. You'll hear that a lot too. Between that and, of course, funding Ukraine, it's pretty obvious that the U.S. regime has totally turned its gaze towards Christianity, and frankly, I'll just say it being a type of antichrist around the world and at home, because at this point the U.S. regime is no friend to Christians anywhere. Perhaps maybe random schismatics or weird Protestant restorationist cults in China that are more just about overthrowing China, but we all know that's not real Christianity. So I think it's very interesting that you note that the Biden regime is definitely not as just kind of, American empire, we're doing our thing. which can almost in certain sense be viewed through an America First lens, what Trump was doing. Not exactly everything he was doing for Israel, but in some senses he didn't go to war, so he was always looking out for American interests like that. But I think it's very obvious now that Biden has truly turned, it's another sign of course, empire in decline, has totally turned towards the internal enemy.
Yeah, that's right. And in a way, I guess the quote from Zbigniew Brzezinski, which sometimes is, stated by, colleagues and academics, but most of the time is forgotten when he spoke in the early 90s that communism would fall in the Soviet Union. So now the enemy of the United States and the enemy, I guess ideologically speaking, in Russia will become Christianity. Orthodox Christianity is the target of our unipolar American empire. So Zbigniew Brzezinski, as a sort of foreign political analyst and as giant of geopolitics, has already marked a target out quite a while ago. Now we're finally seeing that the eye of Sauron is in fact turning onto Christianity, in particular Orthodox Christianity, because mind you, as Conrad said, the evangelical side of things in the US, and evangelicals make up about 20-25% of Christians in the United States, with a very philo-Semitic, very pro-Israel stances, this sort of false Protestantism which arises from who knows what exactly. Like the roots are very kind of tainted and linked to Freemasonry and what other strange and dark roots, shall we say. I think we can probably have a separate episode on the evangelical movement and its sort of implications on foreign policy. But this idea that the Protestants must unequivocally support Israel is a very new position for Christians in general. Notice how, and I guess we'll just kind of leave the Ukraine issue alone very shortly, but the idea that Christians have to be very pro-Israel and very pro-Jewish is wasn't held by traditional Christians, nor Catholics, nor even Protestants until very recently, actually, the last 200 years. So it's very peculiar kind of looking into this philo-Semitic position on the Protestant end in the United States and exactly where it originated. And I guess now that Christianity is in a general decline in the United States, perhaps this sort of philo-Semitism will also start, going downhill. And it will see Joe Biden also, not too keen on visiting Israel on a yearly basis like Trump. Like perhaps with the decline of Protestantism and evangelical Christianity, so will philo-Semitism sort of maybe see a slight decline or some sort of diminishing returns.
Yeah, no, and as you said, the people that are outspoken, there might still be people identifying as Christians that would just go along with the general American regime, the abortion, the liberalism, all this sort of stuff. But the people that are outspoken Christians that are organizing as Christians are more and more becoming just overt enemies of the goals of the current White House, of the Democrats, and of most Republicans. Also, frankly, I mean, even Donald Trump is going to the log cabin Republicans. Like it's really hard to find a politician in America that actually stands for anything traditional these days. But we're going to get into a little bit of that at the end. I want to quickly address, talking about U.S. foreign policy as well and NATO and everything. Serbia, Kosovo, we had an episode about that 2 weeks ago, and things got very close to getting very, very hot. So there was a few skirmishes, a bit of gunfire, some things going on. But ultimately, President Vučić, after meeting with Patriarch Porphyry of Serbia, the Serbian Orthodox Patriarch, who was barred from entry into Kosovo by the Kosovo Albanian forces, he ultimately, despite very much hinting that there's a possibility of him going in and doing something if anything happened, he called for the takedown of the barricades that the Serbs had put up, despite for at least a day afterwards the Serbs were like, no, we don't want to, we're going to keep going. But I believe they've now been taken down. I'm sure he's reached again some sort of way to delay the consequences of some of these license plate and registration issues. I'm sure he may have get some concessions that could alleviate some of the anger of the Serbs in northern Kosovo. But ultimately, Vučić still just is too interested in maintaining face as a potential EU candidate. And I think I've yet to see, I don't know yet if he's actually willing to do what is necessary in this situation. What do you think, Dimitri?
Yeah, I think Vučić still wants to kind of keep some chips just in case the Russian sort of scheme in the Ukraine fails and Russia does enter into this, period of decline and maybe civil unrest. Say if Ukraine does push Russia back, or Russia enters into, maybe say Putin, for example, as the Western media pundits continue saying, Putin say passes away, who will take the reins of leadership? So Russia, I think Vučić really holds this idea that, look, Serbia needs to look out for its own interests, and maybe at the moment it really isn't strong enough to actually sort of plant its flag in the ancient Christian lands of Kosovo, and in fact to warrant them, to regain them back. But at the same time, notice he, on one hand, goes for peace. On the other hand, he meets with he kind of concedes, right, to NATO, to Kosovo, to the Kosovo politicians and the leadership of Kosovo. But on the other hand, he does meet with the patriarch, and he does kind of show the conservative Serbians that, look, I'm still with you, I'm still your guy, I'm not a EU cuck, I'm not kind of going to follow along with this EU status quo. I still believe in Serbia first. I still put Serbian interest first. And at the moment, maybe it's just not in Serbia's interest to, go against the K4, go against the Italian stationed, the NATO Italian stationed in Kosovo. And no, mind you, at the end of the day, what sort of arose this December in Serbia and Kosovo, it did end well. The Serbian police officer, was released from Kosovo prison by the Kosovo authorities. So his particular detainment and his imprisonment was one of the catalysts for the conflict in the first place, because Serbians were very angry that one of their sort of countrymen, one of their Orthodox Christian police officers, was detained, and he was in fact released after all these negotiations. So maybe at the end of the day, this was all like a show of force that, Vucic did kind of show that, look, we Serbians are not what we were in the early 2000s. We're actually willing to, stand up for our rights and stand up for our countrymen inside this artificial Kosovo, Frankenstein's monster creation. And, if need be, we will overstep certain boundaries. And of course, in a way, Vucic's positive, relations with Russia also show that, look, he's seeing exactly what Russia's doing. Its operation is kind of denazification strategy in Ukraine. Is saying that, look, if the Kosovo authorities are going to implement certain genocidal cultural tactics against the people, the Orthodox Christian people of Serbia in Kosovo, then Serbia will have its own special military operation into Kosovo, and they will protect the Christian people stationed there, just as Russia is protecting the Christians of Donbass and Donetsk and Lugansk.
I agree, and I think in many ways, when I say Vucic isn't prepared to do what's necessary, I agree in many ways that the West is trying to provoke something out of Serbia for this. They would like to just kind of neutralize them, totally annihilate them again as they are still regardless the dominating power in the Balkans, the largest country, the largest economy. But at the end of the day, the only way to counter that is to take matters into your own hands, and this is what we're seeing in Russia right now. They as we're seeing, as we said before, if they had taken matters into their own hands even before, they could have even been more successful and never even have gotten into this position. And so, and who knows, the Russians may not even be willing to help, so that could be a part of it. I don't know the behind the scenes situation, but if I were Vucic, I would be talking to Hungary and Russia, my two closest allies in the region, very closely to resolve this with, promises to the other to make sure that you stand by them diplomatically, militarily, and economically when they, cross a border to save the people that need protecting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very much in the interest of Serbia to garner and to sort of hold allies which are close to them geographically, as well as certainly overseas, internationally, Russia. And, unfortunately for Serbia, not all of its recent neighbors, of course, are its best friends, which is one of the reasons why economic sanctions, as well as cultural pressure from the various nations surrounding it, could impact Vucic's decision making and make it just a little bit harder for him to have a sort of base position on Serbian geopolitics and foreign policy.
I think in general, Eastern Europe, Ukraine, of course, obviously, and then the Balkans. We're going to be seeing the next 10 years. We're going to be getting, if you're like a globe collector or a map collector, you'll be getting a lot of interesting ones, I think, because there'll be a lot of weird borders printed for a few months or years that'll then change and everything, which is, that always means interesting things are going on. But that's kind of been a lot of the things, the big World War III news we're going on. We're going to kind of move into our 2022 winners, losers, going to talk about a few other things. Going to, of course, mention Andrew Tate. Andrew and Tristan Tate arrested in Romania. I guess they're out, or some Romanian sources are saying 30 days. Some people are saying they're out, house arrest. I honestly don't know. I care only slightly, just because of, he at one point was associated with Orthodoxy. I guess what I'll say on the record to Andrew Tate is, shouldn't have converted to Islam. It wasn't the right call. Clearly, you lost some blessings there. Ops rolled up on you. But that all being said, I think, again, I'm not pro Andrew Tate. He's somewhat of a gross character in some ways. He says some right things, of course, obviously, but I'm honest enough to admit that if the powers that be were so interested in taking down human traffickers, they'd have arrested, any number of other people before they suddenly arrested Andrew and Tristan Tate. So I think some might say this is a distraction. Others say, they're taking down someone for speaking the truth. I lean more towards the distraction, perhaps, or even more towards the deep psychological psyop with some of this weird thing I'm seeing about with, of course he was interacting with Greta Thunberg, and then there's these anti-human trafficking groups called Greta or whatever, and now it's, I don't know, all sorts of weird cryptic, things going on. But it's interesting, of course, because Andrew Tate is strangely pushed so hard in the algorithm, which is another suspicious thing. But I think all of this going on, it's definitely has something to do with. I mean, he was in Romania, of course, as Dimitri and me were talking about earlier, as a NATO country. I don't know how geopolitical the arrest was necessarily, but Andrew Tate being so relevant for such a short and condensed period of time, and then this happening. I mean, there's something going on.
Yeah, I think there's definitely multiple angles to the Tate arrests. Most importantly, I believe 2 days ago, funny enough, just after Christmas, Andrew Tate personally posted online that Putin is standing up against degeneracy, pedophilia, Western values, and all these other things, which you guys know, but I may not need to mention. And he kind of just spoke out about that and said, look, Russia and Putin are blessed and they're supporting Christian values, and this is a great thing. And he said this 2 days prior to his arrest. And of course, just the fact that Romania, for all its great Orthodox achievements, it has not been probably the most pro-Russian country. And in fact, we spoke on the last podcast about the Moldova-Transnistria issue, and Romania does have some historical. Let's just say the 20th century was not a nice century towards Russian-Romanian relations. Romania actually sided against Russia in both world wars. Romania generally has a very kind of questionable position towards Russia and the Russian culture and people. Despite its, I guess, Orthodox heritage and the fact that it's 95% Orthodox in a way. So Andrew Tate's pro-Putin, pro-Russian positions perhaps have also put him into these target frames. Whether or not he's guilty or not, which I'm probably leaning towards him not being guilty, but of course only time will tell. And there is something needs to be said about the fact that he is mentioning Putin standing up against child trafficking and all of that, and Romanian government has been strongly NATO, and yeah, it's just a little bit murky over there. Of course, what impact this has on the media cycle is probably more impactful than the actual arrest itself, because it does flood the media cycle with all these memes and stories about Greta Thunberg and the Tates themselves, some of their statements, which all in all don't have the same impact as, say, even Zelensky's 45-minute speech, which frankly didn't even make the news, interestingly enough, and it was like incredibly chauvinistic, pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian and essentially anti-Christian as well, where he's straight up pushing World Economic Forum values onto the Ukrainian people and saying that, look, we are going to take Crimea by force. Like, this is nuts. But the fact that this didn't make the news and say the Tate arrest did makes me consider that, yeah, this does look like some sort of NATO/CIA/ just kind of this attempt to kind of fumble the end of the year and kind of shroud it all in this mist of disinformation. That's my personal opinion, but I guess early 2023 will tell us exactly what's been happening at the end of the day, and who's guilty, who's not, and who will come out on top.
Yeah, like you said, it's not to say that this entire story was orchestrated from the top down, but we have to remember, go back into the normie sphere of things. People that listen to this show, you're pretty tapped in. If you go into normie Twitter, it's just libtards dunking on Andrew Tate for getting arrested. So as far as like the hearts and minds, it's changing the news cycle. What this means is a cultural event. It's definitely just going to be used as anti-misogyny, pro-feminism, which people just reinterpret as anti-Russia, because as Dimitri said, Tate had made pro-Russian statements. So I would never endorse Andrew Tate. He's kind of killed himself on the plausible deniability front from these kinds of things with, the wimp videos of him beating young women and things like this. But again, Romania, Hungary, these countries, like, these are hubs of this exploitative cam girl culture and these sorts of things. I'm in no way defending what Andrew and Tristan Tate do there, because it's gross and everything. And there's a whole lot better role models in the saints of the church, I can assure you, to learn about masculinity. But there's hundreds and thousands of other pimps and horrible lowlifes and human traffickers that you could take down in these countries. The timing is very suspicious. But again, talking about some of these other random things, I saw a video on Twitter, I posted about this, from a media perspective, from a media narrative perspective. Russia has always been losing the information war from the English language perspective, as most people are not willing to either listen to our show or subscribe to a dozen Russian language Telegram channels and translate everything and, actually get a clear picture of everything that's going on, and all the counter all the propaganda you hear every single day from the mainstream media. Most people don't have, the time to do that. But Johnny Miller, who has a good Twitter account, labeled Iran state-affiliated media, which I think is funny. but he was interviewing a young couple in Crimea who were able to speak some English, and they just explained that they identified as Russian, that it's silly that Ukraine would think they could take Crimea. It's a Russian place. And they just said that very normally. They were normal looking people. And this is something that, why is Johnny Miller having to do this? Why are there not Russian state affiliated camera crews doing this kinds of thing every day, just pumping this kind of English language content or English subtitle content? Like, it's not necessarily hard. There's no absence of people that are necessarily willing to say these things. I just think I think Russia is just very single-minded in achieving some of these goals that and maybe it's a sign of something good that they're so genuinely, focused on Russia and the Russosphere and their own internal ideas, that they're just not as concerned as a global empire like America is about, presenting counter propaganda. But that doesn't mean that that it's not gonna kind of help make you lose some international appeal, and it's not gonna hurt you on other levels.
Yeah, and I think this kind of leads into the segue of greatest winners and losers of 2022, and which we wanted to talk about in this sort of final segment of the podcast episode today. And of course, one of the greatest losers was the Russian media companies, everything from Yandex to RT to, the Russian channels and even TASS and, all these companies being essentially these media corporations in Russia just straight up losing, being censored completely in Western countries such as the Commonwealth countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and of course Western European countries as well, and of course the United States and even some South American countries just completely being censored, inaccessible via the internet. So Russian perspective on events has been entirely subdued, I would say, in the year of 2022. And Russians have not, as Conrad just said, have not attempted to circumvent this in any way. I don't think their strategies have been ultimately very effective. One of the only places you could find Russian news kind of in an unfiltered way would be, and of course I'm not saying this news is unbiased by any means, but would be Telegram, of course. And even Telegram is ran by Pavel Durov, who is, I guess, one of the winners of 2022. Pavel Durov's software platform, Telegram, which is a social media, in a way, messaging platform app, has gained immense popularity for 2022 by allowing the uncensored reporting of the conflict in Ukraine and, of course, other news internationally. So Telegram has very much risen to this sort of like apex of social media in this year. And meanwhile, the traditional giants of Russian media, such as RT, even very positive Christian channels like Tsargrad TV, have really taken a huge hit this year.
Oh yeah, and when it comes to winners, obviously this might not come as a big surprise. I was going to say Putin. Some might say that he's in a more precarious position, which could be true, but generally speaking, I was going to say, even we mentioned in Brazil, it doesn't look like Bolsonaro is going to be able to pull it out, and Lula is probably going to take power in Brazil, which ultimately is a win for Russia. Lula was one of the founding members of BRICS. Of course, in Libya, we're seeing the large possibility of the entire eastern part of Libya balkanizing with the leadership of Haftar, who is the Russian-backed proxy there. So, and then even in Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo has hired Wagner to fight terrorists there. Wagner is successful all across West Africa, and this is a victory for Putin. Ultimately, the soft power and combined with hard power, their ability, frankly, to wage these proxy wars through their military-industrial complex and things has strengthened. They've maintained their alliances with China, India. They're participating actively in de-dollarization. So ultimately, as long as Putin can manage to not really fumble the bag on the actual and on-the-ground invasion, and either hold out until a substantial gain of territory or ultimately just a direct engagement with NATO in the West, he will be a winner in all of this. That's no doubt, I think.
No, absolutely. Putin's one of the, I guess, in a way, it's one of his, points of note at the end of his career almost as a politician. You can say, well, Putin did turn 70 this year, and, how many more years of, political action before he retires does he have in him? Really, frankly, the retirement age in Russia is, I believe, 65 or 66. So it is a big deal to sort of work past your retirement age, even in Russian culture. If we recall, Brezhnev for a while was considered up for retirement during the Soviet period, and it was a huge, a PR failure for the Soviet Union actually not sending Brezhnev early into retirement. But I'm not saying Putin should retire or anything, but just the consideration that he's working way past proper working age and probably working very hard in Russia is, of course, a testament to his, I guess, his skill and just the way he's developed over the years. And frankly, I guess one of the other great winners of 2022 would be Patriarch Kirill of Moscow and all of Russia, and the entirety of the Russian Church. I think the Russian Church reaching the number of 400 for number of bishops this year has been, foundational. There hasn't been a church since probably the fall of Constantinople or even the Muslim conquest, which has held a total number of 400 bishops in one jurisdiction. So for over 1,500 years, if not, about that much. I would say, no, since the Great Schism, perhaps even, there hasn't been this many bishops of the Orthodox Church in one jurisdiction. Patriarch Kirill reaching this round number of 400 is, I think, a huge achievement for the Russian Church, despite all the conflicts, of course, in Ukraine and overseas as well. Issues in jurisdictions such as South Korea, Japan, and other places overseas, just having to sort of deal with this, soft power from the West against Orthodox Christianity. Patriarch Kirill has done his best, even despite being personally sanctioned by the United Kingdom and things like that, absurd sort of actions by Western powers. Patriarch Kirill has held out his own, and even if he doesn't have many more years of service in him, he has already done such a foundational and tantamount task. And 2022 would be a year of his triumph, I think, despite everything, all the shortcomings and all the difficulties.
Oh, I think that ultimately, I believe that this military conflict will ultimately be seen as a big catalyst to the end of the schism as well, and that'll ultimately be seen as a big victory. And some other winners I want to say, I think Keith Woods and Joel Davis are big winners of 2022. We're kind of going to ape some of their opinions on this. They did a good podcast, one of their episodes of The Boys, which I would encourage everybody to listen to. But as Joel and Keith, they said, I think Nick Fuentes was a big winner, kind of taking America first and bringing Ye along and getting this new platform for these ideas. And, the end of the year, they laid a little low, the holiday season and everything. We're going to be keeping up with that. But along with that, another, in the same relationship to that, I would say Donald Trump so far. Unfortunately, 22 was a losing year for Trump, and I don't say that with any joy. I was, of course, a huge Trump supporter 2016, 2020. And I'll always, in some sense, be grateful to what Donald Trump did for this country and how he kind of brought so many people outside of the mainstream left-right dialectic of politics. But I think ultimately, between his terrible announcement speech, the unfortunate midterm results, and then generally also the stuff, people going after him in January 6th Commission, all this stuff, he's been resorted to selling NFTs. He's generally just starting to finally. The biggest problem for Trump would be fading into irrelevance. And unfortunately, for the first time since he went down that golden escalator in 2015, it's starting to look like he's not quite the most relevant thing anymore. And for Trump, that's just a disaster. And for him, I don't know if he realizes that or not, but if he can't turn that around, it's not going to be a good election cycle for him in 2024. Another winner, I think, is Ramzan Kadyrov. I think the Chechen leader is a big would be considered a big winner. He's been able to really up his power level, his clout, I think, within Russia. He's able to just casually talk about, he's joking and saying he's not serious, but running for the presidency for the Russian Federation and these sorts of things, which is pretty funny. And of course, Erdogan, I think, for 2022 was a big winner. However, 2023 could not be as good for him. Again, he's got a tough election coming up. He's really not necessarily favored by the powers that be right now. If NATO would love to have someone controlling that big army that's much more, just in line with their vision of globalism and the goal of NATO and its anti-Russian stance. So we're going to be watching that very closely. But with all of that, we're probably going to start to wrap this thing up. Dimitri, is there anything any other winners, losers, anything you want to bring up about the war, about the persecution of the church before we kind of send everyone away for 2022 and usher in the new year?
Yeah, I think just on a personal note, we do commit memory eternal to, Daria Dugin, of course, who was killed in a terrorist action in 22, probably the biggest tragedy, I'd say, besides the killing of a lot of Orthodox clergy in the Ukraine and many even innocent civilians, just laity of the Orthodox Christian Church. And all those innocents who suffered from Zelensky as well as this conflict in general over 8 years, I think there'll be a lot more sacrifices and a lot more victims of injustice. But, of course, it's absolutely disgusting that the Ukrainian special forces would attack innocent civilians like that in such a fashion. It's just terrorism is never an option, I don't think. So it should be completely condemned. And Of course, Dugin himself was a big winner because not only did he rise to intense popularity in Russia and overseas, he stood strong despite the assassination of his daughter. And of course, he continues to have enormous relevance both among the Orthodox Christian clergy, with whom he now has direct relations with. He meets up with metropolitans, archbishops, even the patriarch knows him personally now, and Russian Orthodox billionaires as well. So Dugin is in the spotlight. And hopefully, God willing, he remains strong and keeps providing us that great content that he has been doing for the last 10 years.
No, and I think in general, while Orthodoxy, it's been a tough year in general for the church. We're facing a lot of persecution, and there's division, everything. In many ways, some say the night's always the dark. The night's always the darkest before the dawn. And in many ways, though, persecution breeds some of the greatest times in the church. So I think as we're experiencing this right now, we may be 2023, 2024, who knows how soon, but we may be on the threshold of another great, growth and expansion of Orthodoxy and the gospel around the world. And with all that being said, we want to tell everybody to please subscribe to our Substack, worldwarnow.substack.com. We have some fantastic guests lined up for 2023, some people that you couldn't even guess. Like these guests are crazier than you could even imagine. We're going to have some big people on, some of your favorites, some people you may not have heard of that are going to be just bringing a great perspective to geopolitics, to theopolitics, as some people might say our show is about. So be sure to subscribe to our Substack to never miss an article, an episode of the show. Subscribe to us on YouTube, World War Now. Like, subscribe, comment, all of that really helps us out. Share it with your friends. We haven't heard any complaints about anyone that sent the show to their friends and family. Everyone is intrigued by this long-form content, I guess, that we provide. And follow us on Twitter, WorldWarNow_. Follow Dimitri, Canonist. Follow me, Gnomrad. Follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. We've got content there all the time, all day, every day. And it's been, we had a great holiday season. Again, we hope all of you on the old calendar are preparing to celebrate the Nativity of Christ, that beautiful, beautiful celebration as we then prepare. It'll be Lent before we know it, prepare for the celebration of Christ's resurrection in 2023. So again, we want to thank everybody for your support. This was a fantastic year, the first year of World War Now. We're hoping for many, many more. And I'm Conrad, of course. I thank everybody for everything. It really means a lot. This year was fantastic. And I'll let Dimitri send us off.
Of course, Merry Christmas, everybody. Have a Happy New Year. This is Canonist Dmitry Kolyagin signing off for World War Now on the final episode of the year 2022. We wish everybody a fantastic, spiritual, fruitful, and, of course, happy and wholesome 2023.